Meanwhile, President Trump took to Twitter yesterday to announce he's imposing more tariffs, this time on Mexico. He said, quote, on June 10th, the United States will impose a 5% tariff on all goods coming into our country from Mexico until such time as illegal migrants coming through Mexico and into our country stop. In an official statement, the president adds, quote, Mexico has made massive amounts of money in its dealings with the United States, and for years Mexico has not treated us fairly. But we are now asserting our rights as a sovereign nation. The president added the U.S. has been invaded by hundreds of thousands of people coming through Mexico as a result of lawless chaos. Trump also claims that the, quote, sustained imposition of tariffs will produce a massive return of jobs back to American cities and towns because we are firmly and forcefully standing up for America's interests. The White House says the tariffs will rise monthly by 5% to as high as 25%, but would not say what it would take to remove or halt them, only saying, quote, it will be at our discretion on an ad hoc basis. The Republican chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, Chuck Grassley, condemned the move, saying in a statement, trade policy and border security are separate issues. This is a misuse of presidential tariff authority and counter to congressional intent. He said that the tariff threat would seriously jeopardize passage of the revised North American Free Trade Agreement and, quote, I support nearly every one of President Trump's immigration policies, but this is not one of them. That, again, is from Republican Chuck Grassley. Let's bring in now CNBC's Brian Sullivan. Brian, a lot to sort through here. First of all, the idea behind this, a 5% tariff to stop immigration, does that make sense?
Does it make sense? Not to the U.S. markets right now, it does not, Willie, because the stock market is deeply in the red in the pre-markets right now, and we're seeing red across the board. If you're a U.S. CEO, I know you also probably think it doesn't make sense because NAFTA 25 years ago told you that it's okay to move your supply chain to Mexico. We actually encouraged it. U.S. companies did that, and now they could be at risk. Here's the reality. We buy a lot more from China, but we sell a lot more to Mexico. Mexico, in fact, is about a 70% larger trading partner for U.S. companies than China is. This all coming, by the way, Willie, on the cusp of the signing of the USMCA, the unfortunately named new NAFTA, if you will. This catching everybody off guard. 5% on June 1st, 10% on July 1st, going up to the possibility of 25% on $300 billion worth of goods if the president is not satisfied with any changes they make at the border, which, what does satisfied mean, Willie? What is the benchmark here? The market doesn't know.
No, and the president didn't say at all yesterday what that benchmark would be. And let's have this conversation that we've been having about the Chinese tariffs over the last few months, because it's important to underline what a tariff is exactly and who it actually hurts. For cars coming into the United States from Mexico, for vegetables coming in to the United States from Mexico, what will that mean for a consumer?
Well, it's going to mean higher prices. Here's the thing. About 70% of our trade with Mexico is what they call intercompany. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds at 6:03 in the morning, Willie, on the East Coast, but here's the thing. If you are GM, if you're General Motors, you send parts down there, you put them in a GM car, and then you bring that car back to the United States. So in other words, it's sort of GM on GM. Our biggest imports from Mexico, it's not hard to figure out. Auto parts, trucks, buses, and cars. This morning, GM stock down about 3%. 1/4 of every Nissan you see on the road is built or partly built in Mexico as well. That means higher prices for U.S. consumers at a time when the average car loan is already 7 years long.
And the other, Susan, the gaping hole in the argument that the president is making is the idea that imposing tariffs and making life more difficult on Mexico is going to somehow slow the flow of migrants to the United States. In fact, the opposite likely would be true.
Right, and let's not forget trade policy, different than border policy. Much different. Two separate issues. That's what Senator Grassley was trying to do. I think the Arizona Chamber of Commerce put it perfectly. They put out a statement saying it's baffling. No one understands what this president is doing. I mean, I think we see two things with this. We saw Mueller give his remarks earlier this week, and this is Trump's way of changing the conversation. And it's also, I think, setting Trump up to put the blame on somebody else. He's now saying, border security wasn't my fault. I couldn't get it done. Look at Mexico, and look, I'm fighting Mexico over it. Totally changing the conversation, but I don't think Americans will be duped by that.
You know, part of it gets to the root of this presidency. He issued a statement, the White House issued a statement on the president's behalf late last night surrounding this trade policy. It's a lengthy statement. It's an incoherent statement. And it begs the question, is there a White House staff? Is there still a staff? Or is this one individual whose rantings are on this statement about trade? And the other aspect of it is that we have now just put into complete on the shelf 2 trade treaties, TPP, having to do with China, and now NAFTA, which is going to be in difficulty with regard to Mexico. We have no allies in this.
Yeah, to your staff point, look at what they did, though, last week when the president said, was I rational, was I calm, and he lined up all his staff to go along with him. That's what they do.
Two more, hey guys, it's Brian, 2 more points if I may jump in. Number 1 is, if you're looking for Mexico to give more resources, more money, more people at the border, weakening their economy is not the way to do it. The Mexican economy has already been fragile. The peso, their currency, is falling this morning. So if you damage their economy economically, you may damage their ability to actually allocate more resources. Secondly, on the China front this morning, I know it's all about Mexico today, but here, China coming out just moments ago and announcing what they're calling an unreliable entities list. That's their term. Companies or individuals who do not obey contracts or, in their way, treat China fairly. So now, if you will, we've got another leg in the trade fight with China, which is China effectively moments ago creating, I don't want to call it a blacklist, if you will, but certainly they're naming names on companies, U.S. companies, that they view don't play fair, kind of maybe a tit for tat with the Huawei news here. So you got this 2-pronged trade fight going on right now, all at a time when the U.S. markets have already been weak.
Brian, what would Mexico's alternative be today to combat this?
A big, beautiful letter, I suppose, Mike. I mean, remember, the tariffs are not enacted yet, June 10th. Congress comes back next Monday. If there's something that they can do, perhaps Trump is just threatening this, but if perhaps Luis Obrador, the president of Mexico, and Trump can get together and maybe have some kind of an agreement, maybe Trump already has this in his back pocket and is thinking, I'll threaten this, show I'm strong, and then pull this out and maybe settle things down. That's one option as well. Otherwise, it's tough. And if you're a U.S. company who's spent 20 years building a supply chain with Mexico, Mike, you're not going to be able to revisit that in a year. And if we're talking about the 2020 elections, the folks up in Wisconsin and Michigan that voted for the president that have heavy auto parts manufacturing, they better hope this plays out well, because this is just going to raise costs, which, as any economist will tell you, lowers demand.
I want to just jump out of tariffs and into just basically the Trump White House and the way he does business. And I used to work with all kinds of companies, shapes and sizes, and there was something called an MRC, a maniacal rogue CEO. There's 2 types of CEOs. There's a CEO where there's a business plan, and as an advertising agency or consultancy or anything, you're working off that business plan. First quarter is this, second quarter we're going to launch this product. And then there's the MRC, who basically gets up in the morning, let's say Burger King is a client, he's the CEO, he goes, you know what, today we're not going to sell burgers, we're going to sell ice cube sandwiches. And then because there's nobody else within, there's no counterpoint, there's no check and balance, nobody says, Mr. President or Mr. CEO, no, this is our strategy. So we sit here every day, as everybody does, and kind of react to the MRC. There is no logic. There is no basis point. It is a completely emotional, non-thought out, maniacal way of managing. It's bad enough when it's a corporation. It's frightening when it's the President of the United States.
And we know, Gene Robinson, the President loves tariffs. Why? Because it's unilateral presidential action. It's something he can pick up a phone and make happen immediately. So he's going to use those wherever he sees fit, including in somewhere like immigration where it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Susan was right. He's changing the subject, right? What have we been talking about all week? We've been talking about Robert Mueller. We've been talking about his amazing, incredible appearance the other day. We've been talking about possible impeachment, and so Trump goes to his go-to subjects: immigration and trade, and this is stuff he can do on his own. He can impose these tariffs, and he can inveigh against immigration and bash Mexicans and Latinos, because it's really not Mexicans who are coming across the border. Right. It's Central Americans who are coming through Mexico. Apparently he wants Mexico to impose some sort of Iron Curtain-like restrictions on the movement of people, which Mexico's not going to do. I mean, the other thing is that the president, I guess he won't be surprised by the reaction, but but maybe he will. I mean, he seems to have, for a guy who calls himself a nationalist, he has absolutely no understanding of how nationalism works and how a nation, a proud nation like Mexico, is going to react to this sort of diktat, and how he puts Andres Manuel Lopez Obrador, the Mexican president, in an impossible position. He can't cave to Donald Trump. He can't do it. The Mexican people won't allow him to do it. So he sets the stage for just a useless trade war that's just going to hurt everybody.
And if you're wondering if this was a well thought out plan by the White House, acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney said, we're going to judge this on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis, keeping an eye on the flow of migrants. There's no plan. CNBC's Brian Sullivan, thanks for helping us sort through this. Always good to talk to you.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.